In this episode of Deconstructing Comics, Dylan Horrocks talks about his comic Hicksville, 20 years after the release of the first collection. Hicksville commented on the comics industry, but in light of the events of the intervening years, did it go too far or not far enough? Dylan Horrocks talks with Emmet in a moment. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. We're just $6 short of our next goal, which will unlock 15 more vintage episodes. If Patreon isn't in your budget, you can also send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
This is Emmet.
This is Dylan.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Right, I had an introduction for this interview all lined up in my head, and I've just decided to abandon it. Because how do you summarize Dylan Horrocks' Hicksville? I mean, you can make the attempt, but I've got the man himself on the line here, so I figured I would just put it to you. 20 years later, Dylan, what is Hicksville to you right now?
Oh, good grief.
It's lobbing that ball at you.
Yeah, it's funny because my kids are now in their 20s too, and it feels a little like that. It's Hicksville has been there for so long now in my life that it's just this complex part of the family. I mean, it was my first book, and it was 7 years in the making. And I poured into it everything that was on my mind, really, over those 7 years, about comics, about art, about my thoughts about the world. So, yeah, it is a little hard to sum it up, I guess.
I'll tell you a story. Whenever I want to introduce somebody to comics or give them a sense of comics, I mean, there's various books that people have as a favorite handout to people, sort of text introduction to comics. I know some people hand out Watchmen. I don't know why you'd introduce somebody to comics with Watchmen. It's a bit involved. But I give people Hicksville because it's comics about comics. It's a comic book comics, and as you say, you put all yourself into it from the 90s. It's such a snapshot of the comics landscape from the 1990s as well. Everything from the indie scene to the first movements of comics into film, you touch on that quite directly. In fact, for this interview, yesterday I had to rush out and buy a fresh copy of Hicksville because I lent it out to another Kiwi, actually.
You see, we never buy books. They're so expensive in New Zealand, you just get used to borrowing them all the time.
So it's out in the wild somewhere. But it is a book that I keep coming back to, and part of that is because there's so many points of entry to the book as well. The story, just for those who haven't read it, the story concerns a comics journalist, Leonard Batts, who visits the town of Hicksville trying to track down the beginnings of a now very successful comics writer, Dick Berger. He meets Sam Sable, who has become... He's now seen in a lot of press about you as something of a stand-in for you. He meets Grace, and we learn about her love triangle with characters Danton and Coupe. And he also meets Mrs. Hicks, who is the owner of a library with every comic ever published residing in the town of Hicksville. And people in Hicksville, as you said, they just keep borrowing books. Everyone's borrowing
That's
comics.
Right.
Nobody's buying them. And that is one of the joys of Hicksville, this town where everybody reads comics. There's no commercial imperative to make comics. People just make stories, and they share them in this place. And that's why it's such a special place. You're saying a lot there in terms of what comics are, and there is this theme in the book that it's almost money ruins comics, or the emphasis on commercial success ruins comics. Is that something that you were thinking of directly?
Not in quite such a clear construction. I guess I was trying to build a career in comics for myself. I was living in England when I started the story, so I'd gone overseas to London for a few years. And my intention was to arrive in England and start working in the comics industry there, and then, build a career perhaps in European comics. But it didn't really pan out that way. And so I spent much of that time in England working in a bookstore and wrestling with the difficulties of making a living out of comics, or trying to find a way to make a living out of comics. So, that was very much in the back of my mind. I really was at an early stage there where I was very focused on trying to make it work as a career. I guess in a way I still am. So it feels like a lifelong journey. I think working in any, being obsessed with any art form, at some point, if you're trying to make it the focus of your life, you come up against that question of how do I make that work financially? And it's very difficult, because when it does work, there've been times in my life where I was earning reasonable money doing comics, particularly after Hicksville, when I was writing for DC Comics for a few years. And when it is working financially, then you come up against all the pressures to make the stories you're telling commercial, and to write stories that will fit with the requirements of the commercial market. And then your relationship with your work changes too. It turns into a job. It's all these compromises start pressing down on what you're trying to write. So it's a bit of a no-win thing, the relationship between the commercial aspects and just wanting to do it as a vocation. So the main in Hicksville, I guess one of the big questions is throughout the history of comics, why have so many of the is there a great library of masterpieces in comics that never happened because of the pressures of that commercial industry? And that's one of the questions I was wrestling with at the time. The history of comics, how the financial constraints of the industry shaped that history and shaped the work that people did, and most importantly, what they didn't do as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of reviews of Hicksville have mentioned Mrs. Hicks's library in relation to Borges, and you have the idea of the impossible library of books that never were. But in Hicksville, it's not a magical thing. Well, it seems magical, but it's a place where people go to. American comic readers have been going to Hicksville to produce those works they couldn't produce in their circumstances elsewhere. And it's a very sort of ready-to-hand idea of a library.
Well, there are two libraries in Hicksville, and one of them is the library of all the comics that have ever been published. And I hope this isn't giving away a terrible spoiler at this point, but the other library is the library beneath the lighthouse, what I think of as the Lighthouse Library, and that's the library of all the comics that should have existed, but didn't. And that's the very Borgesian one, I guess. And I kind of liked the energy that was created between those two libraries in the town of Hicksville, and the fact that the library of comics that could have existed but didn't is beneath the lighthouse is significant, because the lighthouse serves as both a warning to people not to crash on the rocks, but also it serves as a kind of a beacon. It's drawing people into a place of safety, to a safe harbor. And there's the final sequence in Hicksville, the lighthouse also appears as a crow's nest in a ship for the lookout to try and work out where we're going. And I liked the idea of constructing this imaginary history of comics, a history that didn't exist but could have existed. All those books that could have been done, and then using that body of work, that imaginary history, as a point of reference for us carving out a future for comics.
Yeah.
So that we could try and create the future of comics that we might have had if that history had actually happened, rather than feeling bound to the history we've had.
Very good. And each number of the chapters that in Hicksville lead off with these sort of epigrammatic asides or quotes from comic creators who have faced struggles in producing their work, and there's this almost regretful air to a lot of what they're saying. Again, sort of lighting the way for those who come after them, saying, "Look, be careful, kid. You're going into comics. Things are tough here." Yep. Sorry.
The quote that is now endlessly re-quoted is the line from Jack Kirby that opens the book.
I was going to bring this up with you now, because you've gotten a bit of trouble in this one, because I've read people quoting that the Jack, comics will break your heart, and they were saying, where did he get this quote from? So can I put it to you? Where did you get that quote from?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a fun story. I was standing in a comic shop in Auckland, flicking through new graphic novels years ago, and one of them was 7 miles per second, and which was a Vertigo book, a really good graphic novel, and they at the back of the book was the author biographies, and the artist of the book, James Romberger, in his, it said, James was once told by Jack Kirby, comics will break your heart. And I immediately, as soon as I read those words, I thought, bam, that's, I have got to use that line.
Yeah.
And so I noted it down, and then sometime later, when I was putting together Hicksville as a book, because it was first serialized in a comic book pickle, which I did for Black Eye in the 90s, I thought that is the perfect opening line for the book, and so I used it. But subsequently, people started asking me, where the hell did you get that quote? I've never seen that quote in any of the interviews, and so I tell them, I got it from, it was a line that James Romberger used at the back of 7 miles per second. And eventually, so many people were asking me, I ended up talking to James online, and he told me the whole story around that, which was that as a young artist who wanted to be a cartoonist, he was at a convention and he met Jack Kirby in a lift, and he showed Jack Kirby his portfolio of work, and Jack Kirby flipped through it and then looked at him and said, kid, if comics will break your heart, and tried to persuade James to go into gallery work instead of comics, which James did, and James has combined both comics and a career exhibiting in galleries ever since. Now, more recently, there was a more active discussion on that, because since then, I guess because of Hicksville, that quote has entered the record, and people quote it all the time online, and actually, I've seen it quoted in other books now too.
Yeah, it's spreading. It's like Borges again. This idea of an idea that's sort of infecting us now. It's everywhere.
Well, language is a virus.
Yes.
So there was a more recent discussion, and all sorts of people got involved in that, and various people saying that's I never heard Jack Kirby say that, but actually Mark Evanier, who worked with Jack Kirby for some time in his later years, said that he heard Kirby say those words or very similar words multiple times to people at conventions and so on. So to me that backed up James's story, and James is pretty, he's quite firm. I think James got a little bit annoyed by the whole discussion because he might. I felt a little embarrassed that my book had become the gateway for that quote spreading, when really it's James's story. So
Yeah.
I'm always trying to credit James for that story because it was his experience.
No, fair play. I mean, and it's good to attribute it to him. But yeah, if Mark Evanier say it's happened, it definitely happened because he.
Well, I figure that was
source.
that was good backup for it. Whether Kirby did say it or not, he's not the only cartoonist to have expressed the same view. And there's an almost identical quote from Charles Schulz,
Yes.
who was I think that was from an interview late in his life with Gary Groth, perhaps. I'm trying to remember the details of that one. Yeah, I have I've got 30 years of notebooks and journals stacked on a shelf, and I was going through them the other day and realized I had quotes peppered through them that I'd noted down from some interview. Only sometimes did I note down where it came from, so it takes a bit of digging sometimes.
Very good. Okay, well, I also wanted to touch on the use of geography in Hicksville. So in 1998, Hicksville was it first collected in 1998 or was it first released in 1998?
You first collected, so it was serialized in Pickle really from about 1992 to 1997, and then the very last chapter, actually, that issue of Pickle never came out because the publisher was about to fold, and he said, "Shall we bring out the last issue of Pickle or shall we bring out the book?" And we went with the book.
Good.
So that was in '98.
So in 1998, New Zealand seemed very, very far away.
Yeah, I remember asking my lovely publisher who was based in Canada, Michelle Vrana, when I was doing Pickle, I said, is it okay that this is so New Zealand? The stories are obsessed with New Zealand and full of New Zealand details. And, is that a problem for a North American audience? And he said, oh, no, it's great. They love it. It's exotic. So I don't know if New Zealand's quite so exotic anymore.
Well, yeah, it's certainly been brought into the world more. I mean, Leonard has all this trouble getting to Hicksville. He's cut off from his editor at Comics World magazine. He's constantly asking to use a fax machine. People don't have fax machines. The internet is not factoring in yet. At one point, he mentions he would like to use an email if he could find a modem. So he's being reduced to writing a letter. And it's funny to me because now people are taking to writing letters again so they can get off social media because it's become too intrusive. We're trying to get away from the internet. So it's not only Hicksville's not only a snapshot of the time in terms of what comics were doing then in the 90s, but it's also your perception of New Zealand and how far away from New Zealand you were for a time of the writing of this because you were in London. And then just conveying that sense of distance. And on top of that, you've got this recurring motif of the cartographers in the book. This idea of mapping. And I think that relates to what you were talking about before with the lighthouse as well. There's this sense of trying to find out where you are in relation to where you were. And every reading I keep coming back to that idea of mapping as well, and what you're saying about comics and maps. So this is a bit of a jumbled question, Dylan, but geography seems to be one of the run through of this theme here.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with maps and geography, possibly thanks to discovering fantasy novels when I was a kid and becoming...
You got the little map at the beginning of the book that the authors put in to give you a sense of the fantastical world.
Exactly, all the best novels have a map at the beginning. But I guess in Hicksville, I was I was trying to explore both the place of comics in the world, but also the place of New Zealand in the world. And both of them, certainly at the time, felt very marginal. New Zealand was at the bottom of the world, and absolutely the edge of the kind of cultural map of the world. People outside New Zealand didn't really pay attention to it or even know it was there half the time. I remember in 1980 we spent Christmas in San Francisco, and my brother was talking to an American girl at a bar, and she said, "Oh, you know, what an amazing accent you have. Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from New Zealand." And she said, "Where's that? Never heard of it." And so he spun this entire story about how it was behind the Iron Curtain, and told this amazing saga about how he'd escaped from the Eastern Bloc and made his way to America. And she believed every word of it because she had no idea about where New Zealand was. So yeah, New Zealand felt very much like it was at the edge of the world, and comics felt the same. We were absolutely at the margins of the cultural map, that we weren't taken seriously by anyone. People weren't paying attention to what was going on. And what I wanted to do was point out that a square map is an illusion, that the Earth is actually a sphere, and the surface of a sphere has no center or edge. Wherever you are on that sphere, looking out, you're at the center of the world from your own point of view. So partly what I was trying to do was draw a kind of imaginary map of the world in which both New Zealand and comics were, you know, the most. And I positioned Hicksville at the absolute edge of New Zealand too. It's on the easternmost edge of the country in a very remote area on the East Cape. So I was trying to say, you know, where you are is the center. Now look out and see how the world looks with that as the center, and trying to get a sense of what the whole landscape of art and literature and culture and history looks like from that vantage point. But I find I tend to fall back on geographical metaphors all the time. It's so second nature to me. The most substantial essay I've ever written about comics is one about Scott McCloud, and one of the focuses of that essay, one of the great delights of writing that essay, was going through not only understanding comics but reinventing comics, and finding all the geographical metaphors he was using. It's absolutely full. His work is full of mapping and landscape metaphors. And then kind of trying to deconstruct his work based on metaphors and seeing where that led us. And the cartographers in Hicksville are there. So there are three cartographers in effect in one storyline, which is about New Zealand, the islands of New Zealand coming adrift, and they're floating across the ocean, and Captain Cook, who was the first English cartographer to map to circumnavigate the whole country and map that, and Honaheke, who was a Māori from northern New Zealand, who led a conflict with the British troops in the early 1800s, which was really about trying to define who owned the landscape of New Zealand and who would define the future. And they team up with an artist as well, whose identity actually shifts slightly in the course of the book, but he was basically based on Charles Heafy. So they're all trying to locate New Zealand in the world, and it's because the islands are drifting and they no longer have any firm reference points. And in a way, that's what it felt like for New Zealand. for me growing up, is that the old narratives about New Zealand's place in the world, which were very much the colonial narratives, constructed out of our sense of being part of the British Empire, those had evaporated. We no longer, they weren't useful anymore. But we hadn't really constructed a new picture of where we were in the world. And I feel like comics have, they've gone through similar processes of trying to work out how we fit in. In the 80s and 90s, there was a real push to redefine our place in the cultural landscape, just as the term graphic novel was rising to prominence as well.
Yeah, and one thought I had as well about just Coupe's role as being the lighthouse keeper and the keeper of the secret library was this relationship of comics and mapping again, a sense of, well, the indigenous characters, they had a sense of where New Zealand was. They had a sense that they had done their own mapping, and then this Western cartographer comes along and says, well, this is where it is. But a map from a Westerner is describing something which is already described by a people, but it's seeming trying to replace their description of the thing. And there's some significance to the fact that Coupe is himself Maori, in that tradition of, well, we already know where we are.
Yeah.
And comics are something we were already doing. The sense of telling stories through pictures is something we were already doing. The comics is presented as something new.
Yeah, actually, there's one of my favorite names for comics is the one that's so in the 90s there was a new dictionary of Māori published here, which was kind of updating the language. It included various terms that for things that hadn't existed in the 1700s in New Zealand, and there was a lovely term for comics, which is ngā pakiwai tuhi, and pakiwai basically means stories, but it's there are various connotations it carries around what kind of stories, but tuhi is this wonderful word which means writing, it means drawing, painting, carving. Basically, it's anything that involves making a mark in order to convey something or communicate something. And I love that term because it means it's describing comics as stories told using words / pictures. It's whatever it takes to tell that story you can use. And actually, like many cartoonists, I've been ambivalent about the way the term graphic novel has come to be a kind of it's seen by a lot of people outside comics as a more respectable or almost politically correct term for comics. So when I talk to librarians or academics, they often they use graphic novel to describe any kind of comics. I was once asked by a library actually if I would be willing to draw a graphic novel for them, and I thought, bloody hell, well, I'll just check what I'm doing for the next 10 years, because it does take me a long time to draw these things. And as we talked further, it became clear that what they were actually wanting was a 3-panel comic strip. Oh, okay. And when I said, oh God, I thought you meant like a book, because a graphic novel is a book-length comic, and they said, oh, I thought graphic novel was just the preferred term now, because comics is so negative and disparaging.
It's that virus of language again, replacing terms.
Yeah, and the terms we use, just like colonial cartographers came and renamed the landscape in order to redefine it as something that was part of their possessions. The renaming of comics is also a hotly contested issue, but I have to say I warmed to the term graphic novel more recently when I realized that the term graphic comes from a Greek word, graphos, which actually meant something like tuhi. It was used for writing, it was used for drawing, it was used for, again, making a mark that communicated something. So I now feel slightly warmer towards that.
Nice.
Coming up, how the character of Dick Berger seems more real now than he did 20 years ago. The explosion of female comics creators, especially outside of the big two. How the internet has changed for the worse, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. Tim and Paul race to the scene, where a 1960s Batman TV episode needs analyzing. The show's attitude toward civics.
A loyal taxpayer stooping to criminal methods.
Toward women.
A dish.
Toward time management.
All in all, Batman, you've been pretty busy.
As well as the history, the casting, and more. Tune in via iTunes or Stitcher, or visit tothebatpoles.libsyn.com for
To the Batpoles.
I wanted to take a quick sidestep for a moment. You mentioned Scott McCloud, and I just happened to be reading an interview with him in Hillary Schute's book. She's got a book of interviews with cartoonists.
Right.
And there's a section where he's talking about criticism of understanding comics. And he says, the stuff in Chapter 6, show and tell about words and pictures, the separation of words and pictures, and their reuniting. I think that's considered overly simplistic. My whole definition of art gets a lot of flack, although I've never heard a good alternative. He goes on to describe something Samuel or Delaney said, and then he comes back with, Dylan Horrocks probably wrote the most interesting reaction to the book, something called Inventing Comics. And that was your geography metaphor again, wasn't it? Where you were talking about the landscape of comics. So, he gave you a shout out.
Oh, that's nice. I mean, after that essay was published in the Comics Journal, I ended up I met up with Scott and his family for lunch. And it was so lovely because he just was delighted by the essay. Some people read the essay as, really attacking Scott's book, but he's so delighted to be able to have an in-depth discussion about this stuff, and it's I don't know if you know the book Metaphors We Live by Lakoff and Johnson, and it's in that book. What they're talking about is the way the metaphors that we use in language shape the way we see the world, and the way. And one example they give is that a lot of the metaphors we talk about arguing are combative metaphors. They're about warfare and fighting. You defeat your opponent, you crush your opponent, you defend your position, and so on. So they're military metaphors. But they said, there's an alternative way of looking at an argument, and that's that it's a collaborative process where you're trying to, between the two of you, more clearly define and establish the truth or the details of a position. And that is totally how Scott is. He really is one of those people who genuinely loves to have a collaborative argument. And so it's always such an enormous pleasure arguing with him. It's such a treat.
He's got a lot to say, and he's a little more interested in just getting to the whys of things as opposed to what he thinks. And
he's always so interesting. Everything he writes is fascinating because it's operating on so many levels, and that's like when people argue about understanding comics, most of the time they're not paying attention to the visual metaphors he's filling it with, or it's ironic because he's done it as a comic for a reason. He's not just providing a text and then adding some padding with illustrations. The visual metaphors matter. They're absolutely central to how he's constructing his argument.
Okay, so I mentioned before that Leonard comes to Hicksville looking to learn more about Dick Berger, and what I love about the book is your depiction of Dick Berger's success, this extreme success, and his indulgent wealth and all the things he's doing. In this book, success is making movies and not taking calls from Todd McFarlane, which I love.
He also brushes off Stan Lee at one point.
He does. He was desperate to collaborate with him.
Brutally.
Can I ask you, have you seen Deadpool 2 yet?
You know, my confession is that I avoid superhero movies. I haven't even seen the first Deadpool one.
Okay. Well, you don't need to see the first one. But something interesting occurred to me last night when I was reading Hicksville. So in Deadpool 2, Julian Dennison, who's an Australian actor. New Zealand actor. Sorry, this ruins the point. New Zealand actor.
You know, most Australian actors seem to start out as New Zealand actors, but never mind.
Russell Crowe, yeah. Julian Dennison. He was in Hunt for the Wilder People with Sam Neill.
Yeah.
He plays a character in Deadpool 2 who calls himself Fire Fist, and he is a disturbed young kid who he's been brought up in an orphanage, and he's got all sorts of problems and emotional problems, and he lashes out with his fire powers. That's the part of the plot of the Deadpool 2. And then I'm reading Hicksville, and you've got Dick Berger's teenage comic, and it's about a disturbed kid, and his name is Fireboy, and he shows it to his idol, his comic creator idol, who says, "Kid, are you okay?" And I immediately thought of Fire Fist. And Julian Dennison being in New Zealand as well. It's this perfect loop in my head, but maybe
delicious.
just to me.
That's just too good. The funny thing about that is that when I look at Hicksville now, which I only do usually when someone thrusts it at me to get it signed, it strikes me that the whole world of comic book success that I present in that book didn't really exist when I drew that story. Dick Berger's massive wealth and his importance in the film world, and the fact that he leveraged his success to take over a big, now runs a huge media conglomerate. It didn't really exist back then. A successful cartoonist could the most successful cartoonists at the time were people like Todd McFarlane, who, because of Image and because Marvel had started paying royalties and so on, there was a story going around, I think it was Todd McFarlane or one of those Image guys had a private helicopter, and that was absolutely the pinnacle of where you could get to in comics. But the idea that they would also dominate something like Time Warner, the idea that superheroes could be the central, the most successful franchises in the entertainment world, I kept thinking I was pushing it too far. It was ridiculous. I was going much too far in the story. But now, I look at it and I think, he looks like Small Fry now. Comics has become absolutely central to the entertainment industry. It's absolutely surreal.
Yeah, and the mythologization of Stan Lee has
I know.
Now he's all over all these movies. He keeps appearing in all these movies, and there are kids today who would never have read a comic, but they know who Stan Lee is.
Yeah, I mean, Dick Berger now feels more I don't know, he's more real now than he ever was. It's a very strange feeling.
But also what you've predicted there is it forms in line with your theme of the marginalization of comics, because what's happening today is comics are being made into a film, and the films are taking off and having huge success, but the comics that they are sourced from are being left behind. People aren't necessarily going to the stores to read the comics these films are based on. And I feel
that's right. And
I was just going to say, I feel you anticipated all of that.
Yeah, I didn't consciously anticipate.
How could you?
Where is this going?
Yeah.
It is strange. I mean, when I was working for DC, that was during it was the early 2000s, and it was the time when superhero movies really were starting to become, they were just starting to become a really big thing, and even then there was this strange disconnect between the constantly growing success of the films. They were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more lucrative, and the fact that the actual comics industry, the mainstream comics industry, seemed to be continuing its decline, its sort of slow, painful decline, and the sales figures on the comics that were considered successful were about at the level which in the 40s and 50s they would have been considered catastrophically unsuccessful and cancelled. It was a very it's a totally bizarre industry. I'll never get my head around it. But at the same time, graphic novels and sort of independent comics, or whatever you want to call them, art comics or literary comics, they were exploding. They were really taking off at the same time, and starting to win all sorts of literary awards, and they were finding their way into all the best bookstores and getting written up by people in the New York Review of Books. And so simultaneously the what we think of as mainstream comics were sort of sliding downwards, but their content, they were content providers. So they were for the entertainment industry, and the content was going nuts. It was enormously successful, but also the comics that had always been outside of that mainstream field, they were growing and growing too. And then we get to where they are today, wherever comics are today. Good God.
Yeah, and in Sam Sable and the Magic Pen, it's sort of a spiritual follow-up to Hicksville, which features the character Sam, who's in Hicksville as well. You have this notion of, because you've removed geography as a factor now the internet has arrived, and you've collapsed all that sense of space. So if you produce a comic in one country, a person outside of the world can read it on Tumblr, and that is your depiction of how things have shifted since Hicksville came out. Is that something you still observe to be true, that people are having more freedom to produce comics now, that there's less of a commercial hindrance or a cost prohibition with money and where you need to be, and you can just produce comics wherever you are?
Yes, I do think that there's never really been a better time to be making comics. It's so easy to produce them and get them out there, but also there's such enormous range and diversity of comics at the moment that when I started doing comics, it still felt unusual when you came across a comic by a woman. Today, it feels like comics are on the brink of becoming, there's talk about parity in the comics industry, and I think the mainstream part of the industry is still some way from achieving that. But outside the mainstream industry, I'd say maybe we've passed that point. It's beyond parity now. Certainly the cartoonists, the emerging cartoonists whose work I see and whose work I feel, this is really important. This is the future of comics. Are mostly women. that's an extraordinary change from when I was first involved in comics all those years ago, and not just women, but non-binary cartoonists and transgender cartoonists and queer cartoonists and cartoonists from all over the world and every ethnic background. I mean, it's a really exciting time for comics opening up as a form and every genre imaginable. So it's and also the history of comics is being rediscovered and retold in different ways. Those maps are being redrawn all the time. There are new maps being drawn of the history of comics. Everything from Michael Tisserand's book about George Herriman, which really centers and foregrounds the fact that George Herriman was a person of color who was passing as white while he was drawing Crazy Cat, and then rereading Crazy Cat in the light of that. This isn't exactly a new revelation. We sort of have basically known the basic facts since the 70s, but as a New Orleans historian, Tisserand has really dug deep and rereading Crazy Cat, which really is one of the all-time great comics. Reading it in the light of that, it reads very differently. You suddenly realize there are layers and layers of commentary on identity and race and racial narratives, and I mean, it's so fascinating. So it's a really, really exciting time at the moment in comics. I would say the internet explosion, I have a lot of concerns at the moment about where the internet's going too, because in the early 2000s, I guess when I started writing the Magic Pen, I still had a sense of the internet as really leveling the playing field and opening things up to everyone. At the moment, but even then, there were the beginnings of a feeling that the internet was going to become a battleground between governments and corporations and everyone else for control over the internet. And at the moment, I feel like everyone else, us, we've lost that fight at the moment. I don't know if the fight's over. It'd be lovely to get some more progress, but at the moment it feels like the internet is increasingly controlled and locked down by an unholy combination of corporations and states. And so we're increasingly being guided by algorithms and everything else, funneled towards ever more popular commercial properties. So I'd say it's slightly less wide open than it was. The internet's less wide open than it was 10 years ago.
And it's also being used, again, we come back to cartography, it's being used to try and remap what has happened to comics and push back towards a more retrograde version of comics.
Well, it's interesting.
Particularly where women are concerned. Again, it's this notion of if you have a woman character, she should be a sex object, like Dick Berger's Lady Knight. That's the version of women in comics that is preferred by certain groups, let's say.
Yeah, I'm not so. I mean, well, I am very worried about all of the alt-right and the manosphere and all of those battles at the moment in general terms. For comics, I feel like feels to me like they're fighting a losing battle.
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope they're losing. But the backlash is intense at the moment. But it feels to me in comics like a backlash. It feels like the change and the progress is so enormous that they're going to lose that fight. But actually, in terms of mapping, the internet as a whole, my wife's involved in health research, and there's been a lot of talk about the use of big data in health policy. So taking all the data that we can gather online and through our digital lives and digital footprints, and using that to try and get find out new things about the landscape of the world's health issues. And so I think about that a lot. The internet at the moment is becoming this huge data landscape, which we're all feeding more data into. And what's happening now is that both corporations and governments are using that data to map the landscape of our lives. And just like any mapping, the assumptions you take into that cartographic enterprise will shape the results. And once you draw a map based on those assumptions, you start to see the world through that assumptions. The landscape starts to be defined by the map. And I mean, this has been one of my obsessions all along. It's a big part of Hicksville and the essay on Scott and Atlas, my unfinished epic, which I still pull out now and then and work on, which is about a cartographer and cartoonist who appears in Hicksville as well. So I'm really interested in the way the internet is providing an opportunity for people to construct a new map of everything and of all of our lives in a way that will inevitably distort that reality in potentially quite damaging ways. That was quite a big digression. I apologize.
I thought it was lovely. I think we're going to wrap up because you've gone on a bit of a magical mystery tour of Hicksville and all the things that Hicksville touches on. And as I said before, every time I read it, I discover new things and new entry points, and it sends me off on new digressions on my own. So listen, congratulations on 20 years. This is a fantastic piece of work, and long may it continue. And really looking forward to seeing what you come up with next, man.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure talking to you. Is there anything you'd like to touch on before we go? Is there anything, or maybe would you like to point people to where they can find you? What's coming up next?
Yeah, so online, my main, you can mostly find me on hicksvillecomics.com. It's the best starting point. And I'm on Twitter as Dylan Horrocks and so on. The book I'm working on at the moment is about Dungeons and Dragons, and
that was something I was going to ask you about, but I left it off. Yeah,
well, you see, it's all about maps.
Yes,
it's about
exactly.
But it's about maps of imaginary worlds. So that's a long, slow. It takes me a long time to do a book. So don't hold your breath, people. But there will be something eventually.
Hicksville is published by Drawn and Quarterly. Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com and on comicon.com, where our new episodes usually go up on the Friday before they appear in our feed. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Tell the world why you enjoy Deconstructing Comics. Our theme is from bensound.com. Once again, don't forget we need just $6 more in monthly pledges to reach our next Patreon goal and release 15 more vintage episodes. Help support the show with a pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Poles, we discuss Burt Ward's 1995 memoir, Boy Wonder, My Life in Tights. The book is full of exaggerations, tall tales, and outright fibs. Is it still valuable as a work of bat scholarship? Listen to the Bat Poles in its own podcast feed on Apple Podcasts or other podcast apps. Then next week, an interview with Stephen Gilbert, a comics retailer and creator of the comic Colville. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.